Today's episode is a little different. I have a guest on the show, Marsha from Milaro Invite. We also have a role reversal. Marsha is going to play the interviewer and she's going to interview me. But before I turn it over to Marsha, let me give you her background. Marsha is a program director and lead instructor for the Great Connections educational program for young adults. And those programs develop the knowledge, reasoning power, and self-confidence needed to live in a free society. You can hear her discuss critical educational issues with such notables as philosopher Stephen Hicks on her show Conversations with Marsha. And Marsha also writes on a broad range of topics from research neuropsychology to philosophical biology to contemporary culture. I may also say that Marsha's writing has appeared on the Savvy Street. But now we'll shortly get to meet her in person, albeit virtually. Welcome to the show, Marsha.
Thank you, Vinny. And thanks for having me on to interview you about this really interesting topic, which is about how fictional worlds affect our worldview. I'd like to introduce Vinny on this topic. Is Vinny Kolhotkar. He's a freelance journalist, novelist, screenwriter, and finance professional. He's the chief editor of The Savvy Street. Vinny's authored a TV pilot screenplay, Undercover: The Story of Jamila, and 2 literary thrillers, A Sharia London and The Frankenstein Candidate. He's also the author of Media Wars: The Battle to Shape Our Minds. It's a book that analyzes in depth the impact of the anti-enlightenment narrative shaping the world today. And starting with that, so you talking about the anti-enlightenment narrative. So tell us, what do you think the purpose of storytelling is besides entertainment?
Well, if you ask a cognitive science researcher, you got to kind of almost reverse the question in that we've got to ask the question, why do stories entertain us in the first place? And their answer is that stories act like simulators, not dissimilar to aircraft simulators, air flight simulators, the army uses and even commercial flying uses. So they put pilots, young, inexperienced pilots, into extremely difficult situations. Stormy night, lack of visibility, engine malfunction, and so on. In situations like that, more than half the pilots might crash and kill themselves and destroy the plane, but they are learning lessons of flying without risking themselves. So stories are like virtual life simulators. We're learning the lessons of life without actually risking ourselves. We're sometimes sitting in a dark air-conditioned room with people around us that we're ideally unaware of, in a very comfortable place, but our emotions are going from high to low in a way that we're actually experiencing a very difficult situation. So to answer the question, what purpose storytelling serves is to impart life's lessons from a very young age. I mean, children as young as 3 and 4 are read bedtime stories, and then we continue to consume stories until we are 70 or 80. So we get the lessons of life through concretes as against abstractions. And that is the purpose storytelling serves from the viewpoint of the reader or a viewer. From the viewpoint of the artist, there are different purposes that storytelling serves. One of them is to impart a situational empathy for a situation that might exist in a faraway land like Africa, where you actually, if you physically go and experience Africa on your own, it might be very difficult. You got to get vaccinations and flights. So you get empathy for somebody's situation in Africa without actually physically going there and meeting them. You may also seek to persuade people to a certain point of view. There is what I call a vicarious escapism in some movies, like or books for that matter, like Fifty Shades of Grey, where vicariously women that are not necessarily beautiful can find a billionaire, handsome man, and it sold hundreds of millions of copies. So that is a kind of a different. I don't use the word exclusively escapism, but it's a vicarious kind of escapism where you live the life of someone you would rather live the life of, which is different from what Ayn Rand called the sense of life experience, where a moral world is set up in front of you and it inspires you, so which is another purpose to give readers or viewers for that matter a sense of life experience. This world is possible. And last but not the least, it sometimes inspires us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. So the intent of the artist may be to inspire people. So the purposes served are different for artists in that I include producers, directors, and of course there is always a commercial purpose because we want to, as artists and as producers or directors, we want to make money. As publishers, we want to make money. But from an evolutionary standpoint, the purpose is served because it's a life situation simulator.
So I understand you cast it as having a lesson, and I understand that you can learn a lot about the experience of whatever happens in a piece of art from that. Uh, Is that? But on the other hand, you're talking about entertainment, so is that's not about having a lesson. It's a different kind of experience, isn't it? You're trying to get something else out of it besides a lesson.
Um, we're not necessarily, as readers and viewers, trying to get something out of it. We are there because we are being entertained. What we get out of it happens to us. So let's see if we can actually define entertainment. And I often bring up this in talks that I give on this, and you ask people, would you rather listen to a very sad melody that makes you almost cry, or a song that doesn't move you at all? Inevitably, the answer is I'd rather listen to a sad melody. And so you're being entertained. And the cognitive science researcher would define entertainment as transportation or immersion. They're the two terms they use most often. And they mean the same thing in the cognitive science research into fiction. What they mean is you are immersed so totally in the world of fiction when you're reading a book or when you're in a movie theater or some other form of theater that you forget your world temporarily, at least. You forget where you are. You're not conscious of, you know, the person sitting next to you just eating popcorn and you don't hear it. So that's transportation and immersion. So transportation is entertainment. So entertainment is being immersed is you're being entertained. And the reason mostly that happens is the first thing that needs to happen is arousal. So we walk into a movie theater, we're not aroused, particularly emotionally or calm. At some point in this movie, ideally within the first 10 or 15 minutes, you got to get aroused in some way. The emotions got to be either fear, like in the movie Jaws, or trepidation, or intrigue, or wonder what happens next, or joy even. Any emotion will do. And once that happens, that emotional state has to vary the longer the immersion. So if you're talking about a book that is, I don't know, 500 pages long, we won't keep at it unless our emotional state varies a lot. You can't just have fear all the time. Even in a horror movie, your fear will come down and then go up again, come down. And there are false highs and false low in this horror movie. The high is actually, oh, maybe it was nothing. Oh my God, it is terrible. And so that variation in emotion will capture you for the length or the duration, especially in the theater. But if it is a book, it keeps you going until you finish the book.
Mhm. How is so how is art or fiction different than entertainment? Or is this a subcategory of those?
I would say narrative art is a subcategory because you could get entertained from songs, but if you look at the lyrics of a song, there is a story in there anyway.
Hmm.
And music directly affects a certain different part of the brain, which musicians, not necessarily consciously, but they exploit that fact that music is ingrained in the brain, whereas a narrative artist cannot exploit that fact. Well, although he can in a movie which is musical, or we can't exploit that as novelists because we don't have music coming out of the book.
Hmm.
But a director always does. I mean, if you watch an exciting movie that you watch several times, try watching it with the subtitles with the sound completely turned
Yeah.
off, and you don't get the same level of emotion because the background music score
Yeah.
is creating emotion.
Yeah. So then you're saying, I'm just trying to understand. So you're saying entertainment is a wider category than fiction? It,
Uh, yes, but narrative fiction is fundamental and it's crucial. It's probably the largest part of it.
so does all, I'm trying to understand why we're using this term entertainment separately from, say, film or fiction. What does it give us? What does it tell us? Is it that some art is not entertaining? Is that it doesn't have these emotional highs and lows?
Uh, the in the sort of cognitive science research world, the phrase entertainment is not typically used at all. It's like transportation and immersion.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, we, what they've analyzed and found is the narrative arts, the fictional arts, affect our worldview very fundamentally. So they focus on those narrative arts as against maybe some other form of entertainment, like watching a game of sport is very entertaining, and it is a world of business. But for the same reasons, we are transported to the world. We're watching Super Bowl or whatever you are watching. There is unpredictability about, ideally, about who's going to win, and there are highs and lows. So it is not a scripted narrative, but it is still a narrative. Um, but a scripted narrative is the one I wanted to focus on today because it has it firstly it does affect people's worldview. It changes them much more than watching a game of sport would, I believe.
So how does it
And
do?
um, the reason is does that again. I will quote some cognitive researchers. I'm going to name a few,
Mhm.
the most prominent ones that I know, so your our readers can access it themselves.
We could put it in the program notes too.
Sure, is Melanie Green, Michael Dahlstrom, Tobias Richter, probably the most prominent ones. But the way in which their contention is how a fictional world affects our worldview is firstly, when your emotions are high, you are immersed. So that's the first thing that happens. If you're not immersed, a lot of these effects will not actually happen to you. So you got to get drawn into that world. You got to get transported.
Mhm.
So transportation's got to occur. Now, the first thing that people do is they assume, and I'm not saying when they do, it's necessarily a universal reaction, but it is a common reaction. They assume the fictional world is typical of humanity, or at least typical of a certain place. So the most likely, most famous villain in Hollywood, the trope, if you will, is the big bad corporation. And
Mhm.
it gets repeated so often that people assume all corporations are big and bad, or big corporations are necessarily always bad. But when you actually look at a movie script as a statistician, it's typically about two or three lead protagonists. Same thing goes to the novel, it's about a few lead protagonists. No statistician would say the stories of three people are typical of humanity, but we are, because we are wired that way, we are wired to take it as a lesson. We're wired to think it is typical of humanity. So that is kind of the first effect. The second effect they've noticed is when our emotions run high, the critical faculty in the brain is dampened a little bit. It's not absent. I mean, you and I could watch a movie that is strongly anti individualism and we won't buy it because we've got a strong bias against it and that will overcome it. But if you're talking about a 12-year-old who hasn't developed a strong worldview as yet, or even those that are relatively neutral, they're going to get affected much more significantly than we would because their critical faculty is lower. They're assuming the narrative is typical of humanity. The other, the key other thing that happens is the subliminal or explicit, as the case may be, messages in the narrative are absorbed into the person's worldview. And worse, or worse or good, actually, depending on how you want to look at it, um, those messages are retained after the emotional high ends. You leave the movie theater, a few minutes later, your emotion level is back to the default state. But it's almost like a subconsciously that new worldview is being integrated into your old worldview.
Mm.
So a few weeks later, when you come back into the world to watch another movie or read another book, there is a confirmation bias already existing. So it, in fact, fortifies and strengthens over time. Dahlstrom indicates that not only it has affected a view, it's retained, but it actually strengthens it over time, and that may be a confirmation bias.
Is
Uh,
that because you experience it as a real thing that happened, and so you kind of retain it as a fact about reality in a certain way?
Probably yes, because we've experienced it as an allegory to reality. So whether or not it happened in real, it may be there may be a disclaimer based on a true story, but therefore not an exact replica of it, or it may be pure fiction. But good fiction always has allegories to real life. So
Well,
the human mind that is entertained, unless you're transported, unless you're immersed in the narrative, you wouldn't assume that it actually physically happened, but its lessons are pulled in. So if you were a pilot learning how to navigate through a big storm, you come out of that, you don't assume that the storm actually happened. You're obviously inside a simulator, but you learned your lessons about what to do inside a storm. So the lessons are more permanent than a directly unrealistic assumption that these things actually happened.
yeah, I wasn't implying that you thought that they actually happened, but the experience was as if they did, and so it becomes part of your memory.
Oh, absolutely, as if they did. Yeah, you hit the right button there. It's perfect. As it's the post narrative experiences as if they did.
And in artwork, it seems to me that the artist, the better they are at selecting out the things about the story that are so essential that they really stick with you. And that's part of the reason why you're immersed in it.
Probably, I mean, if we go to story structure, the final message would actually come at the end, but you got to get people to that, especially in a book. It's not easy to pull people through 400 pages. Most often in a movie theater, it's very rare that people leave early. So, an ideal story structure in terms of a completed story structure, which we don't get in the new form, which is TV series, is so complete, so final that, like a screenwriter, Robert McKee, the screenwriter guru, he says there's nothing more to be said anymore. And so the first thing that's got to happen is the pre-story world, the prologue. It may not be called a prologue, but Aristotle called it prologue. Has to be shown so that we have some empathy
Mhm.
for our lead protagonist. What is their world like? And then there is a catalyst or an inciting incident that then engages us emotionally and we're drawn into the story. That triggers, ideally, should trigger a goal towards which the lead protagonist is, he or she is driving towards. And in the final outcome, and so there should be increasing jeopardy, which will make our emotions move up and down. Uh, and ideally, if you have an internal journey as well inside the lead protagonist, the internal journey is completed before the climax, so that there is a sort of what we call an in the cave moment, or which is kind of deep brooding, deep contemplation, reflective moment. It's also known as in literature, in screenwriting literature, it's known as the dark night of the soul.
Mhm.
And then there is a changed person, fights the climax, it's resolved. The post-resolution world is different.
Mhm.
So it's much more than the goal is achieved, the person has changed, or
Mhm.
something else in the world has changed. So it's not just a threat of a shark,
Mhm.
as in Jaws, has gone. Besides that, something else should have changed. And that message, whatever the change is and why it occurred, is very likely to be retained in higher forms of entertainment as against
Mhm.
Jaws, which someone like Rand would have called it. Yes, it's romanticism, but it's a lower level
Mhm.
romanticism.
Mhm. So you happen to mention what's TV programs. What are the trends in the way fictional worlds have been used to affect our worldview? You know, what's going on? How could the trends affect education?
They have been affecting education very, very, very significantly for a very long time. And initially for good, then later on not so good. I mean, broadly, I would say for people who were born in the sort of late 40s up to 60, the so-called baby boomer generation in America, I believe certainly the extent of Christianity in America at the time was more than it is today. But I would contend for a lot of school children at the time, their worldview was strongly shaped or more strongly shaped by Captain America, Batman, and Superman more than the Bible. And I may be wrong about that. And certainly I was reading comic books a lot in the 70s before I moved to sort of higher forms of literature, so to speak. Now, those stories were about heroism, and the heroes, if you will, are very clean, morally upright heroes. So Superman doesn't have a moral flaw. His flaw is kryptonite, which makes the story interesting.
Mhm.
Then there were trends in the 60s that Ayn Rand spoke about naturalism, which is you dropping the entire classic story structure I spoke about. There's no resolution. It's like what she called a slice of life narrative. It's simply, okay, this is what it is. Now, if you're an artist and who wants to engage you and elicit situational empathy, which I spoke about earlier, you are getting that.
Mhm.
And you may very, very likely exaggerate it. You'll see that in the movie called The Parasite, which won the Best Film last year at the Oscars. And you ask any South Koreans, it's strongly exaggerated how the rich mistreat the poor. And also, we're talking about one rich family mistreating one poor family, but the lesson will be absorbed as if all rich families
Mhm.
mistreat all poor families. So, in that sense, that affects us. And there are two very newer modern trends that I personally find extremely disturbing that to me are far worse than what Rand spoke about naturalism. The first trend was exhibited in Dunkirk, 2017 movie by Christopher Nolan. In that, most, or if not all, the lead characters have no names. And it's a kind of a war that is never, it's simply not experienced as a good versus bad. It's just what is bad, and it doesn't matter who's fighting who.
Mhm.
That's the way we experienced it. So not only is there no good or bad, there is no character to empathize with. There's no catalyst. There's just literally the characters have no names.
Mhm.
And to me, that is so much worse than naturalism. because with naturalism, you still have this ability to empathize with the character, get situational empathy. You may not be persuaded to the point of view that is being propagated. But
Mm-hmm.
and it's likely. I mean, I've watched movies that might be called naturalistic, and I've been entertained by those.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Dunkirk, I clearly did not have immersion. Neither did my wife. We were sitting next to each other. We actually moved seats and then spoke to each other at times. The theater was half empty, so we're clearly not being immersed. So fortunately, that sort of destruction of story structure in its entirety, as against naturalism, has not succeeded. Then we had another phenomenon in 2019, which is the most disturbing trend. And that phenomenon initially started with, I believe it was Wonder Woman, that got all these OT directors, the big Martin Scorsese's and all those, complaining that what they show is real cinema,
Mm-hmm.
and all these sort of superhero trash, what they call superhero trash, it shouldn't be classified as a movie at all. It should have a different rating, like an X rating or adult rating or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were whinging and whining, someone else, Todd Phillips, did a remarkable movie, exceptionally well done. It's called Joker, and you may have seen it. Well, what he did was he took the trope of the comic book hero icon and changed it. Now, the Joker is not actually a hero in the Batman movies, but if you read the Batman comics, you would never empathize or sympathize with the
Mm-hmm.
Joker character. He's bad. Whereas Todd Phillips has shown him as a very sympathetic character. And he has used very classic story structure. He has done it magnificently well in terms of execution. You know, the background. We spoke about music. The background music score is fantastically good. The acting is outstanding. I mean, deservedly won the best Oscar for Joaquin Phoenix. So much of it, and it's kind of a victim culture, but so much of it is good.
Mm-hmm.
That trend where you can take a comic book hero icon like a Batman or Superman, you can show Batman in the opening scene on a TV series with his therapist complaining that he has depression, so he's just like one of us, and that's not actually his flaw.
Mm-hmm.
But you can change the flaw. That would have an effect of amending a culture. Now you can show Superman um, blowing back. You know, he often does with his super breath. He blows the oceans down. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, the big bad corporations have neglected their civic duty, and therefore the ocean levels are rising, and we have this whole climate change, and it's Superman to the rescue. In 2018, I watched the new Robin Hood, and he uses the word inshallah, which is or he or little John, which is very disturbing to me. And I thought, wonder if they're going to do a Robin Hood who fights against the Christian Crusades instead. I mean, there are some allegories to that, even in that. The latest TV Green Arrow, which is based on Green Arrow, it's just called Arrow. Uh, he's always against not only big bad corporations, obviously, but which is a trope, but also there is a mention of climate change. So you can get these successful icons and turn them into against the narratives that they were previously against. I mean, who did Captain America fight? The Nazis. Who does Batman fight? Hardcore criminals. But we could get them fighting those evils that are not really evil. And that I see as the most dangerous trend. And Phillips maybe doesn't know it, but director Todd Phillips has opened a door to something that is very dangerous.
Mm. Interesting. Very interesting. Is screenwriting literature or and are thrillers literature?
Oh, my contention certainly yes. Robert McKee mounts the argument against authors. And he said, I went to an author director and I showed him a blank page and I said, okay, direct this. As the authors are regarded as the author of the movie.
Mm.
And they can't because there is no script, whether it's adapted from a novel or an original one, there has to be something on paper. A story's got to exist.
Mhm.
So one could argue that screenwriters are literary artists, even if they are adapting. But
Mm.
certainly, if they are writing an original screenplay, I mean, a lot of directors are both. They're screenwriters and directors. And Christopher Nolan's taken over that role. Previously, Jonathan Nolan wrote the script for The Dark Knight, and his brother Christopher did a wonderful job, I thought, in directing it. But in Dunkirk, I believe Christopher Nolan did both and didn't succeed. Now, but when you come to the print form of literature, I would argue that um, it thrillers are sort of not only literature, but in fact, a genre like literary thrillers does exist. And there's some, you'll see in Google, there's some argument about that, where some people say that genre cannot exist because if you're reading a Patterson novel, there isn't enough time in 90,000 words to really get you to know the character well. And
Mm.
so we can't empathize with the character. But you take it definitionally, literary simply means it must deal with the issues of gravitas. So if you deal with what Rand called lower level romanticism, you've got the classic detective chasing a serial murderer, right? Now, if your ethics and morality comes from communism or left liberalism or capitalism or anything else, it doesn't really matter whether you're Buddhist. No one is, I hope, going to regard the serial murderer as a bad person, as a good person, sorry, apologies. And so we have our empathy squarely with the detective. And what interests us is the plot and the intrigue and the cliffhangers. And, well, who did it? It's a whodunit.
Mhm.
But a literary novel must have more gravitas than that. It shouldn't be lower level. It must deal with issues of gravitas, where the moral answers are not obvious. Who done it isn't obvious, but the morality is obvious. The killer is a bad person. The detective is a good person.
Mm.
Now, but a thriller is actually defined by its structure. So the first thing we notice in a thriller is like a page turner. There's a cliffhanger ideally at the end of every chapter, or at least very frequently enough. Um, the prose is endearing and nice, but not necessarily so long that it drags you down. The dialogue is lively and subtextual. So there's a variety of techniques, and essentially the plot moves fast. There are twists and turns. So that can definitely be combined with dealing with issues of literary gravitas. And I would contend that not only literary thrillers exist, but for me particularly, I tried to create one, particularly my second novel, Sharia London, and I would contend that it is what I'd call a literary thriller. It's about 117,000 words, so it's not terribly short. I can spend enough time on the characters as well. Uh, and I tried, in fact, to create another genre which I call a cinematic novel. Now,
Mm.
that term has already been used, and Elmer Leonard is, I believe, uh, the person who won, the author who won the first title, the cinematic novelist.
Mm.
I'm not sure whether there is a definition I'd like to sort of offer. Not so much a definition as what constitutes a cinematic novel is that in a novel there are a range of freedoms for a novelist. They can narrate outright. And so it is the case with movies as well. If you look at the Shawshank Redemption, Red Redding is narrating, and he's the protagonist rather than the actual hero in Andy. So you could very often authors do directly narrate. They break the fourth wall. If you did direct narration in the theater, it's what is known as breaking the fourth wall, and it's not considered the best thing to do. You can use other techniques to throw that exposition, because what you're doing is you're throwing the exposition in directly, and you can throw the exposition into the dialogue and sprinkle it like salt and pepper. So that's the first thing I do is just cut out all direct narration, all backstory, and then you in each and every scene you could write it from an absolutely unique point of view. So you have the omniscient point of view, but if there are, let us say, two or three characters, you and me are in a scene and it is your scene, then everything is seen from Marsha's standpoint. In that, so the reader is only with Marsha. So if Marsha looks beautiful that day, she can't see it unless she's looking at herself in the mirror and admiring herself. We can't write how Marsha looked. We can write how she felt by italicizing her thoughts. So it disciplines you to say only what Marsha says. Now, some authors use that technique to write in the first person. I've even seen Harold Robbins in another recent bestseller where the word I actually is being used by three different characters depending on the chapter. And that obviously forces you to uniquely give only a single point of view, automatically disciplines you. You're straight-jacketed. But what you then lose out is the viewpoint of other characters, which is why these authors are forced to use the first person I with three different characters in different chapters. But I would contend you can discipline, and I did so. I think I succeeded about 95, 99% of the time in Sharia London to discipline yourself to write every scene from one exclusive point of view. So there's no point of view shift, which can jar
Mhm.
a reader and bring them out of an immersion state. So yes, literary thrillers do exist, and I offer my novel as a testament to that. Yes, a cinematic novel can and does exist, and it's a genre that other people can use. Now, not everyone likes it because some people love the sort of more detailed form of literature. But
Mhm.
it, it,
I wanted to ask you, so not everyone has had a chance to read your novel, A Sharia London. So I wondered if there was another one, maybe an older novel, a thriller that you would uh, give as an example of a literary thriller.
before Sharia London, I wrote the Frankenstein Candidate, and I must confess I don't think personally I was on the top of my game at the time, but it's assuredly literary. It turned out to be somewhat prophetic. It was written in 2011, published in 2012, about a billionaire who would have an extraordinary effect in what was then a futuristic 2020 US presidential election. The billionaire is a good guy, by the way. It wasn't like Trump. It was more sort of much more like a libertarian, if you will, or an objectivist. And it certainly had both elements. And some of my readers have actually enjoyed it a lot more. So we never know. We might think I've done better in A than B, and more of my readers think I've done better in the second and the first, which is a good thing than the. But some readers thought done better in the first and the second. So that is another example. I've just started working on a third one and just been outlining it, and I'm a detailed sort of outliner. And that one I have very much. I mean, I'm writing it as a novel, but I have very much three things in mind that sort of make it more make it more appealable, or have more appeal to filmmakers in
Mm-hmm.
particular. And two, so there'll be a lot of visual scenes. And two, I'm going to try and extend these two genres that I spoke about. A literary thriller, it's going to be thriller, and it's going to be you deal with some issues of gravitas.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly want to write it as a cinematic novel. So
Well, that sounds very wonderful. If you can, that you're working on that, and I guess I wasn't clear enough in what I was asking you, which was, are there any well-known books, like older books or classic books, that you would consider a literary thriller, just so that we can have a specific example that we might most people would know?
um, I I read Atlas Shrugged when I was 14, and I at the time definitely I found it thrilling enough. I mean, I finished it within a month, but it is the size of 7 novels, so it wasn't easy going. And it's without question highly literary. I mean,
Mhm.
Rand also excels, spectacularly excels at symbolism and prose. I don't know anyone else who excels to that extent. So she doesn't meet the criteria of what I call the cinematic thriller, a
Mhm.
cinematic novel, but undoubtedly she meets the criteria of a literary thriller. I would think the first major novel I read rather was The Godfather. Again, it's very famous by
Uh,
Mario Puzo.
sure. Sure.
It took you into a different world. I was so confident. I read it at 13 and I was very confident. Puzo must have been ex-mafia to be able to write so well. He was inside man. And it turns out obviously he wasn't.
Yeah.
But that is like this beautiful thing that happens.
Yeah.
Some people who write, who introduce you into that world, do not use what I spoke about, the screenwriting structure properly, or do not adapt the novel properly. Adaptations are key. And therefore, they feel inauthentic. Like Dunkirk really happened, but Dunkirk movie to me felt inauthentic because he focuses, I think Cameron focuses on the wrong things, denial of character, denial of heroism that obviously happened. So yeah, I would classify Puzo's book as, without question, not as literary in terms of the prose and symbolism that Rand had, but it dealt with a world that previously was unknown. So it definitely was a lot more than a serial murderer being chased by a detective, which is the sort of James Patterson trope.
Well, and
And it, yeah,
I mean, one of the main issues in the novel is the transformation of Michael's moral character.
indeed. And so that was decidedly another sort of literary device. We spoke about the internal journey. And a decisive internal journey. And in this case, it wasn't necessarily a good internal journey, but there was a
You know,
transformation.
aside from the events, all these thrilling events that happen, there's also this moral change, and that's more of more gravitas than just mere events. So,
Absolutely, 100%. I agree with you. So it's without question qualified as literary, but whether it qualifies as a thriller for some depends. I mean, for me it did at the time. I couldn't put it down. So
mhm. So why don't that many screen adaptations work? What happens with them?
it's a very good question. We've been asking, I think, the wrong question. Readers who like books then go see the movie. And in the past, in the last 3 4 years, things have changed dramatically because of Netflix. But prior to that, a lot of adaptations didn't work. And that wasn't the fault of the screenwriter or the director. We were looking for the wrong thing.
Mm.
And so, first of all, books that did very well, and they were thrillers or they were, forms of literature that people loved a lot, they had read them. And sometimes there are books that are simply not bestsellers until the movie becomes a bestseller and then people read the book. I
Mm.
did that with Slumdog Millionaire. I thought it was a very good movie. And then I read the book on which it was based, the question and answer, I think it's called, book. And I thought the movie was better in that case than the book.
Mhm. Well,
But
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that Alfred Hitchcock was famous for taking mediocre novels and turning them into fabulous movies.
um, yeah, in fact, most producers look for very short novellas or short stories. And I'll tell you the reason why. The Great Gatsby is one novel that's been done 4 times. Uh, and it, I believe, has around about approximately 48,000 words. So it's a lot shorter than the standard length of, say, 90 or 80 to 120 is sort of standard. And obviously, some are much bigger than that. The standard screenplay that has to obey a certain format
Mhm.
of how you write the slug line. It's on a A4 sheet of paper, 12 font, double space, Courier. Uh, that standard screenplay is approximately 120 pages
Mhm.
for a 2 hour movie, which is a standard length of the movie. And of course, some movies are shorter than, and some are longer, but it's kind of rare to exceed the 90 to 120, sorry, the 90 to 140. So 110 is kind of the norm. 110 to 120 is medium length. That screenplay would typically have 28,000 words. And so you take Great Gatsby, which is a very short novel. It barely classifies. It goes over the jump from 40 is the jump from novella to
Mm.
novel. And typically a screenwriter would not write as much prose. You don't need to, it's redundant. You won't describe the sunset. It's like you write day or night. And if the director decides, I want a beautiful sunset on that scene, the viewer will see it. I don't need to
Mhm.
transport a screenwriter to, oh, how beautiful this scene is. So a 28,000 word screenplay would translate, if you reverse engineer the process, it would translate to something like a 40 to 50,000 word novel. So you can take The Great Gatsby and decide, I don't need to cut anything at all, and make that into a 2 hour movie. You take any standard size novel and you simply cannot do that. You've got to cut something. Otherwise, it's not going to fit 2 hours. It's going to become 4 or 5 hours. You take Atlas Shrugged, which is, I believe, 600 and thereabouts of 650,000 words. I mean, that is a huge epic, and it just cannot be done even in a trilogy even, because you translate it back into the slots, as I said, of 40. 40 is a 2 hour movie. 3 times 40 is
Mhm.
120. It's more than 5 times as big to fit a trilogy.
Mhm.
But what we've seen recently is the trend, and Netflix has become very dominant now. Trend towards TV series. What we used to call TV series, we used to sit in front of them and say, "Oh, Tuesday night," but now you can binge watch.
Mhm.
And in those, you can definitely take any kind of long novel. Most novels, I believe, would fit one season. If that does
Mhm.
well, you got the extended season. So then you would have an adaptation and a possibility that no crucial scene is missed.
Mhm.
Otherwise, the readers who are fond of certain books are looking for what is missed and what's missing, and inevitably they will be, because you cannot take
Mhm.
100,000 word novel and create a 2 hour story on screen without missing a lot, without choosing to, you know, the artist, the novelist has already been a selective chooser, if you will, of, I'm going to focus on this, I'm going to delete this, I'm not going to. But then you got to do another huge round of editing to cut the novel into half or less than half. So inevitably, everyone's disappointed.
Mhm. Well, thank you for this fascinating discussion